If I could have your attention, please. Good afternoon. It is the time we are scheduled to start. In fact, in the best European Parliament tradition, it's 2 of the time we were scheduled to start. We have this afternoon an extremely exciting session with a very distinguished guest. And in fact, President Klaus will be arriving in a few minutes' time, along with UKIP's party leader, Nigel Farage. I'm reliably with us in a matter of 10 or 15 minutes. I'm delighted to have the honor of moderating this session. We are also to have a number of visitors from outside our group and outside the Parliament who are here with us on this occasion. Good heavens! I appreciate the support of my colleagues in calling the meeting to order. Now, what we will do is, in a moment, I will invite our good colleague Peter Mack to say a few words about length of time and with whom he has worked closely. Perhaps I can just take this opportunity, Peter, to congratulate you on marriage. I'm and delighted to see you here in the audience, as she was at the UKIP conference in Doncaster, I seem to remember. Excellent. I would also like just to recount a couple of personal reminiscences I have of President Klaus. Of course, I've followed his career and his opinions with enormous interest. He is the only head of state from a European Union member state who has consistently been utterly sound on the issue of Europe and utterly sound on the issue of climate and energy, and I admire him on both of those grounds. I've had the pleasure of meeting him on a number of occasions. A couple of years ago in the United States at the Heartland Institute conference, which was dealing with climate issues. Highly qualified scientists who take a skeptical view of the story on climate change. That was a great pleasure. President Klaus has also written a number of books, including an excellent book on the climate issue, which he entitled Blue Planet in Green Shackles, a very evocative title. And when I read it, I was both amazed and delighted to find on page 4 a footnote in President Klaus's book which referred to a piece of work which I had previously done. I think that's the nearest achieving fame and fortune, so I was delighted by that and of course extremely grateful. Could I, on that note, invite Peter Mack to say a few words about our distinguished guest. Thank you.
Thank you. I will speak in Czech, so you can prepare your earphones. I just wonder, Roger, whether some visitors can fill in these seats. Maybe that. What do you think?
They would have to be available for additional members of MEPs who come in. But if people want them on a temporary basis, then okay. I don't have a problem with that.
Dámy a pánové, já bych rád řekl nejen pár.
Ladies and gentlemen, I'd be happy to say a few words, not just about but also about how I see the events 25 years ago and the consequences they have for the present day. I was of age in 1989, and back then neither I nor anyone else in then Czechoslovakia would have had any inkling of the fact that that year see the collapse of the communist regime. No one would have seen it coming, and I don't think anyone would have dreamt of the idea that in 2014, 25 years on, we'd be sitting in remote, talking to you and talking to Czech citizens. So something has changed. And then, when there were the first uprisings against the communist regime, we saw a communist president, but a dissident in the castle in Prague, who had fought Václav Havel, belongs of the dissidents group that I'm talking about. He was imprisoned for his political views, and another Václav Klaus. He was a teacher of economics. He was teaching the sort of economics that didn't enjoy an official blessing in those days. So when he finally became finance minister, he had very good underpinnings. He knew what a market was and how a market worked. That it wasn't tenable for the state and for its officials to decide on what should be produced and where it should be produced. He knew that the state should not decide the price in the market. As a young citizen, I became a fan and advocate of that sort of change. I was someone who was in favour of both Václav Klaus and Václav. We could be proud at that time of our country. Other events occurred. There was the split of Czechoslovakia into two individual states, and Václav Klaus was able to assert his ideas in the foundation of his own political party, and I, for many years, was a member of that party before 5 years ago I joined the Free Citizens Party, which I established, in fact. Coincided with the Civic Democratic Party. Now, why did people want to dream away the communist regime? Well, they could see westward over the border that there was prosperity and that our regime wasn't working. People in the West could do what they wanted and we couldn't. In other words, the people, the citizens, to get rid of the totalitarian regime we had then. We didn't want a small group to usurp all power. We didn't want people to take every decision because they had that power to decide over us in final effect. And it became clear, little by little, that in 1989 that apparatus of state and power was only partly defeated. We got what we wanted in the form of freedom and freedom of speech, and we were free to work where we wanted. We could establish businesses as we saw fit. We had freedom. Nonetheless, we had the feeling that something wasn't quite right, and we see today that have come in from outside and have been dictated to us from remote, without us having the opportunity to influence those things. See that politicians, at least in the Czech Republic, and perhaps some politicians here, but our politicians were running up debts and paying taxes. At every opportunity they would do that. So I had the feeling that other things needed to change. firstly at home in the Czech Republic, and secondly in the EU as a whole. These were things that would hang together within the EU. I believe that we gave up too little in 1989. We left too much power in the hands of the state. And I feel that we now should endeavour further to roll back the power of the state. And I fear that a country that doesn't do that will not enjoy a positive destiny. And I think the Czech Republic and other countries politicians, in particular when it comes to the incurring of debts. When you're a politician, it's very easy to spend money. It's very easy to attempt to buy popularity with the voters. In order to spend money, taxes have to be raised. And I'd like to see it enshrined in the chair that politicians are not entitled to do that sort of thing. That was when he ceased to be Prime Minister, when he was brought from office by political circumstances, and Miloš Zeman won the elections in 1998. Václav Klaus returned to the backbenches, and then he presented draft legislation, a mandatory balanced budget. He was not successful in that. The Czech Republic has raised national debt by over 1 billion krona. I believe that our constitution must be changed to ensure that the run up debts like that. And secondly, we need to reduce the scope politicians enjoy to increase taxes time and again. In 2002, the Swiss adopted legislation to this effect, so that in the Swiss constitution there is now runs balanced budgets, including in times of economic crisis. When I wanted to implement, I was laughed at. I was told Switzerland is a tax haven, but similarly Germany has engaged. Germany will run a balanced budget. Rises. Switzerland is a case where this actually happens, where they have enshrined in their constitution what the ceiling of taxes should be. In other words, if Swiss politicians by more than 8 percentage points, they have to conduct a referendum first. In other words, political power on such taxes, and then the political power that emanates from Brussels. We must limit the political power that emanates from the EU. So I believe that the Czech Republic should leave the EU. I'm in favour of it working with other countries, certainly so, but on a voluntary basis. So far there's been no political support in my country for that idea. But I think we should leave no stone unturned, fighting for an end to Brussels dictating to us. So they cannot impose on us what we do not want for ourselves. So I intend to pursue an initiative to amend the EU treaties that the euro ceases to be an obligation on one and all. There are only 2 countries with an opt-out on the euro now, where this is enshrined in their treaties. These two happy countries are Denmark and the United Kingdom. As far as the Czech Republic is concerned, I would like to see an amendment to the treaty to the extent that no country should be obliged anymore to introduce the euro if they don't want to, and those countries have the opportunity to leave the euro. In other words, what I'm looking for is a voluntary participation. I know the Parliament doesn't have that much power on this question, but Parliament can propose at least half Parliament supported that idea, then the European Parliament would be able to change, and then the nation to convene a convention which would then be able to deal with the issue. For all people, for my country, I would wish the ability to resolve all our problems 25 years after the Iron Curtain fell, and the first biggest problem is the tax powers, and the second biggest problem is the uncontrolled, unfettered powers of the EU. So I've set my goal as at least, I believe our guest is already in the wings.
Much for that our guest is arrived, so I shall go and greet him and bring him to the podium. If I patience for 60 seconds, President Klaus is here regaling himself with a glass of water, but Nigel Farage will be here in just a moment and be before you. So a minute or so and we should be ready to resume. Thank you very much.
Dovolil využít.
Perhaps if I may, could I use this remaining time? Was the finance minister in the Czechoslovak government when he started his own party, the ODS? He remained in office till 1997, and then he became president. of the parliament. And then he became the head of state of the Czech Republic for 10 years. So he's the former president of the Czech Republic. He is a professor of economics.
A few seconds. I'm very glad. Ladies and gentlemen, as you can see, our distinguished guest has arrived. We are delighted to have him here today. I am personally delighted. And to introduce the UKIP, that is Nigel Farage on my right, who will say a few words of introduction for President Klaus. Thank you, Nigel.
Thank you. Good afternoon, everybody. 5 years ago, the wall came down amid scenes of great celebration, and all the talk was of new nation states and of the rebirth of democracy. And a huge amount of hope, not just in Central and Eastern Europe, but actually across the world. But the new players in democratic nations, little piece by little piece, I think, been seduced by the European Union into beginning to surrender many of the freedoms that had come to those countries after the fall of the wall. And indeed in this Parliament, I've watched quite a number of MEPs come from former communist countries. On day one they arrived, and within 18 months they generally think that membership of the Union and political integration is a good thing. Well, against all of this and against the political classes of Central and Eastern Europe effectively selling out, against this, one man has stood absolutely firm and unwavering in his state, and his views on supranational government have always been clear. I think one of the most fun member of this place was when President Klaus addressed here in, I think it was February 2009, and he said the problem with you people in this place is you're not listening, with which 200 members of the socialist group got up and walked out. And that really was rather a special moment. We are delighted to have you here today to speak on this platform 5 years on from the fall of the wall. Thank you very much indeed for coming.
Good morning, good afternoon. Many thanks for the invitation. I must say that I haven't been in Brussels for years. I have to admit that probably it's well known that this is not one of my favorite places. So if I have a chance, I prefer to go to some Nevertheless, thank you very much. I didn't come here to make a surprising speech, new message or something new. I the invitation to speak about, as I understood it originally, 25 years after the fall of communism, which is a topic which is absolutely fundamental for us these days, and in our countries of Central and Eastern Europe, every day we have some conferences, discussions, to be on this occasion also here. I must say that I probably didn't read cautiously the invitation, because I understood it originally as 25 years after the fall, and then I discovered that it's Europe 25 years after the fall of communism, which is not an identical topic. Nevertheless, let me say about this anniversary. Europe is the second of the story. I am really convinced that we should not forget or stop discussing communism, its fall, the challenges of the post-communist transition. Let me say a few words about that. It has been almost forgotten that communism, the most irrational, oppressive, cruel, and inefficient systems ceased to exist suddenly and relatively quietly. It fell at the same time in most countries of Central and Eastern Europe, and with some delay also in the Soviet Union, in spite of all the non-negligible differences among the countries of the former Soviet Bloc. Proved that the common features, even though we all somehow supposed that we were unique, the common features were stronger. It's also probably time, after 25 years, to say that after the fall of communism, we got the feeling, when we became suddenly free, we got the feeling that the world did not quite understand us. The degree of the lack of freedom, of the irrationality of the old system, the oppression we had to go through in the communist era was highly underestimated. On the contrary, the degree of our understanding of the free world, which we were not part of for such a long time, proved to be higher than most of the people in the West expected. Despite the long-lasting communist propaganda and action, we knew about the capitalist West than the non-communist world knew about us. I'm afraid this asymmetry is there even now, after long 25 years. To keep reminding future and generations of all the cruelties of the communist era is undoubtedly important, but not to correctly interpret the later, in many respects milder, stages of communism makes it difficult to understand the rather sudden and bloodless end of communism, to comprehend the planets of the post-communist transition, and to be able to look sharply at the current era, at the developments both in the communist world, in Europe, and in the rest of the world. Everyone, especially expected that the end of communism would bring about a shock, chaos, disorder, civic war. As we know, this did not materialize. Even in the Soviet Union, where communism lasted more than 7 long decades, it foundered more or less quietly. This relatively quiet end reveals the weakness and effective defenselessness of communism. Communism in 1989 needed just one last straw. The subsequent reactions of millions of people started automatically, spontaneously. One of the reasons for this was that the communist regime was in many respects an empty shell. In the final stages of communism, original pillars of its ideology, of Marxism and of its derivative, the communist doctrine. I remember, and I have to repeat this story, that 10 years before the fall of communism, a friend of mine, professor of one American university, came to Prague and asked me whether the people really do believe in Marxism and communism. And the answer, which I think is worth repeating, I said, well, I don't believe in Marxism here. There are more true believers in Marxism at the University of California in Berkeley, than in the whole communist Czechoslovakia at the time. So this is part of the story which helps to understand the relatively, as I said, relatively sudden, really quiet end of communism. With all my criticism of various details of developments in my country and elsewhere, I think I have to insist that the post-communist transition or transformation was a success. The criticism of its particular aspects is undoubtedly justified and more than welcome, but its positive tendency can't be disputed. I think to this group, to this fraction, I would like to stress that we organized a rapid systemic change. We proclaimed very early and quite explicitly that we wanted capitalism. We resolutely refused all dreams about a possible or desirable convergence of existing economic and political systems. What we are getting now, however, is not the first way. It is the old, well-known, the European socialism. The decisive part of the transformation was the massive and wholesale privatization and a radical liberalization, deregulation, and desubsidization of the economy. This liberalizing tendency lasted, to our great regret, only part of the previous 25 years. Partly due to the loss of our momentum for domestic political reasons, but mostly because of our approaching, entering the EU, we started a reverse. That's why our economy and society is more regulated and subsidized and than 10 to 15 years ago. The final blow came with the recent financial and economic crisis and with the methods of its medical treatment by means of a very extensive government interventionism. In any case, our society and our economy happens to be more regulated than we imagined in the moment of the fall of communism. We did not believe it could ever. It seemed to us that the government masterminding and society was so discredited by the communist experience of ours that it cannot return. We were wrong. We also assumed that everyone accepted that the government failure is inevitably much bigger than any imaginable market failure. That the visible hand of the state is always much more dangerous than the invisible hand of the market, that the vertical relations in society are less productive and less democratic than horizontal relations, etc. Again, we were wrong. It is undoubtedly connected with our entry and with the fact how the EU is or how the EU functions. I have to stress that in the moment of the fall of communism, what we wanted was to go back to Europe. On the streets in Prague, in the moment of the Velvet Revolutions, the slogans were "Back to Europe." Probably the first who tried to explain to the people in the country that the slogan "Back to Europe" means something else, avanti into the European Union. So instead of going back to Europe, we went back to the European Union, and this is what we feel as a problem. It is quite evident that entering the European Union, we didn't become part of a healthy, various, fast-growing economic era, and that we didn't become part of a truly democratic entity. We observe almost every day new and new proofs of the loss of our sovereignty. With growing despair, we witness the reversal of our liberal reforms into new era of omnipresent government. I am afraid that Europe continues in the same blind alley now as before, regardless the deteriorating economic data, regardless the waning respect and position of in the rest of the world, regardless the deepening of the democratic deficit we are confronted with, and regardless the undeniable increase of frustration of those who live in Europe and are object of this progressivist and constructivist activity. We live in the era of economic stagnation, but the economic stagnation facing is not a historic inevitability. It is a problem. It's an outcome of a deliberately chosen and for years and decades gradually developed European economic and social system on the one hand, and of the more and more centralistic and undemocratic European Union political other. They both, and especially they together, form an unsurmountable obstacle to any further positive development. So I would repeat, what we go through is not an accident or it's a self-inflicted problem. It's a self-inflicted injury. Hundreds of small, first sight innocent details have metamorphosed serious systemic problem. I hope that all of that is well known to this fraction. At least no one is leaving the room when I am speaking, which is a pleasant surprise. So I hope at least this fraction of the European Parliament is aware of all. And I hope and I believe that you will try to use your important political roles, to do something with it. So that's my dream, my belief, to discuss what to do. A different topic, a different gathering, a different meetings. So stop at this moment, and thank you very much and for your attention.
President Klaus, it is to have you here. It's been a real privilege to listen to you, and I'm sure that many of us in the room are 100% on side with just about every aspect. Time and opportunity to ask you to take another 20 minutes to speak to us about climate and energy issues, but that wasn't on the agenda today, so I shall have to miss out on that, despite having enjoyed your books on that subject. That is speech, but it does not conclude the business of the afternoon, because we have two other very distinguished speakers on economic of the European situation. 25 years came down. First of all, it's my privilege to introduce Mr. Richard Sulik, MEP, our colleague, who is an economist, a businessman, as well as a politician, founder of the Slovakian political party Freedom and Solidarity, and he designed Slovakia's flat tax system. It's quite a record to go on. Richard, we look forward enormously to hearing what you have to tell us. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much. My plan was Slovak, but I heard we do not have a translator.
Yes, I'm sorry.
No problem. It's a good opportunity to speak German, because it's years after Berlin Wall. Also noch einmal vielen
So thank you once again for the invitation. I'm one of the few who have been able to experience both sides of the Iron Curtain. I was born in 1968, that year where our Russian brothers came to visit us. And I was 12 when we fled to Germany in 1980. In the first 12 years of my life, there were things that I can remember. We had a house, things that were guaranteed to us. There was virtually no crime, but there wasn't much by way of freedom. You couldn't be an entrepreneur, you couldn't travel, and there was no real freedom of speech. The outcome of all of this was that there was no standard of living in all of the Eastern Bloc countries. And then when we fled to Germany in 1980, from one day to the next, I saw the huge difference in these two different models of society. I could see what capitalism had to offer, and I was surprised that the people that had benefited a lot from this capitalism, that is to say the Western Europeans, time and again they questioned this system. The communists that were in power back stole people's freedom openly. But this was also done in the West, in part, or manipulated in part. The next 10 years of my life, from 1980 up to the fall of the Iron Germany, and I saw that there was more freedom. You could set up a company, you could say what you wanted. But I was quite taken aback that you couldn't buy milk after 6:30 p.m. or if you wanted to bake bread, you had to have different types of recognition as an artisan, and so on and so forth. It was difficult. Freedom of speech, okay, you had it, but it had its limits. In 1988, there were surprises. In 88 and 89, the wall came down on the 9th of November, and then on the 17th of November in the Czech Velvet Revolution, there was euphoria. It was undescribable. You can't imagine, if you weren't there, what went through people's heads. The expectations that people had were so high. Opportunity for a new beginning for Czechoslovakia, or later our Russian brothers left after 89, and this new beginning, this opportunity, was grasped by Slovakia, and I think it has been used pretty well since. It took a few years for the transformation process to be there was the split from the Czech Republic. Things had to be built from scratch, but by the beginning of the 2000s, 2002, reforms were carried out. Tax reform, as already mentioned, but other administrative reforms, pension reforms. And freedom, when you gave them a free hand, then the economy takes off. I think it was in 2004 where the degree of freedoms in Slovakia reached its high point. Then in 2004, well, then we joined the EU. Now, I'm not going to say that things went to pot then. Nevertheless, I was very surprised that people that had lived in the West, people that had grown up under that then they all these rules. I couldn't understand it. I still can't understand it today. Why is it that in society, politicians have this urge to regulate every single thing? I'm not saying that rules are bad, but I'm convinced that most rules are unnecessary. Society and humanity develops much better with fewer rules. So 2004, as I said, was a great year. Lots of reforms took effect, such as tax reform on the 1st of January 2004. Then on the 1st, we joined the European Union, and we only saw positive outcomes during the first year. So things were on the up. The growth rates were comparable in Slovakia to China. And I thought that that could have carried on for some time, for some years. But unfortunately, the socialists came to power, and they showed the downsides to democracy: populism. They said, we can guarantee you security. A beer will cost 2 kroner. Elect us. And unfortunately, populism is not what helps the society develop further. After 2004, with the socialists at the helm, we increasingly felt that the EU not all they were cracked up to be. more and more people who came out and said, well, perhaps we were too hasty in joining the EU. In 2006, Slovakia took a decision with great consequences, and that was that we would become part of the EU, i.e. that we would agree to the single currency. Unfortunately, there were virtually no critical voices to be heard against Slovakia joining the euro. There was one voice in 2007. President Klaus visited Slovakia, and in the concluding, economists have worked this out. We see disadvantages. I was a consultant at the finance ministry at the time, and I took what he said on board, but he was right. We threw our hat in the ring, and now we're in the Eurozone. Now we have to be liable for other countries. We've had our freedoms curtailed. There are guarantees to the size of an annual budget that we have signed up to save other countries, which you just didn't have under socialism, but you now have with the funds. You had how many trams Czechoslovakia would develop that will export to Poland, and how many litres of oil were needed, but no one said you're going to be liable for the Bulgarians. But that's what's happened. The level, the degree of socialism in the EU is becoming ever greater. From 2014 on, there are many people in the European Parliament who think that that's a good thing. And I think that this trend will continue. Socialism is not just being responsible for foreign countries, but it also means higher taxes, higher debts, more and more rules, ring-fence people. So it should come as no surprise that other corners of the world where there is more by way of freedom, that these areas are developing quicker. I don't want to live in a country where fish swim. But nevertheless, I can understand. I can't understand why we need a year for planning permission, whereas elsewhere, why you need all this red tape and paper instead of things happening in one day. Why is it that our society has all these rules and regulations on the maximum power of a vacuum cleaner, for instance, or why highly intelligent people believe other people how many litres their toilet system should flush. There's 6 or 8 litres. Okay, it might help in the south of Spain where there's no water, but not in Slovakia. Water in the EU. But that's the situation. That's what we've got. In conclusion, 25 years after the fall of the Berlin, it's clear. What can be seen? Well, firstly, Western countries, due to the rules and the high taxes, cannot sustain their standard of living in the long term. Our children will have a worse life than we do. Secondly, despite the fact that people in these Western countries are not ready to see that we'll have to agree to accept less term leads to the outcome that they vote for populists. It's not just in the East, it's in the West as well, in France as well. People, the net result is higher debts to finance a standard of living that does not correspond to the reality. 25 years after the fall of the Berlin Wall, the EU is not the promised land. And at some point we'll have, and the quicker the better. This will mean less damage as a result. We can't carry on with debts. At the beginning of the crisis, debt levels were lower than they are now. Nevertheless, some people are brave-faced enough to say that we've beaten the crisis. Now, Portugal has got 130% debt and much lower levels before the crisis. Since the fall of the Berlin Wall, I think the important message is that you can't do anything without freedom. That's what we need to fight for. Freedom. Freedom that adults can do what they want to do, and politicians. Thank you.
Thank you for that, for freedom, and I think that's something we will all want to support. You've also told us how the Slovak Republic walked blindfold into the euro. So it's Professor Philip Bagas is the author of a book called Have a copy here, and I'm sure these are available. Stock. Perhaps there is a small stock outside. Philip is a professor of economics at the University Rey Juan Carlos. I don't know how my Spanish pronunciation is there, in Madrid. He's written a number of books, including Deep Freeze, Iceland's Economic Collapse, and of course, as we've said, The Tragedy of the Euro, which has been translated into 13 languages. Deflation will be published. So let me, on that note, pass the floor to Philip. Thank you very much indeed. We look forward to hearing.
Let me say that the book, they are not a big stock outside, but if you Google it, it's free on PDF in the internet. Well, thank you very much for the nice introduction. Group, it's a great honor and pleasure to be here on the 25th anniversary of the fall of the wall. When it came down in '89, by surprise, including economists, the Chicago School, Sherwin Rosen stated in 1997, quote, "The collapse of central planning in the past decade has come as a surprise to most of us." And Ronald Coase also stated, "Nothing I had read or known suggested that the collapse was going to occur." Well, there was one the Austrian School of Economics, because the great Austrian economist Ludwig von Mises had announced the impossibility already in 1920 in an essay called Die Wirtschaftsrechnung im sozialistischen Geweih. So Murray Rothbard already in 1971 referred to Mises as the prophet of. So in his 1920 essay, Mises the challenge that socialism would bring affluence. He shows that socialism does not lead to a wealthier society, but rather to planned chaos and poverty. He points out that socialism simply cannot work because it makes economic calculation impossible. even if it were possible to completely altruistic being, relentlessly working for the collective, socialism would necessarily, quote, the impracticability is the result of intellectual, not moral, incapacity. Even angels, if they were endowed with a community. So Mises defined in the means of production. All commodities, intermediate products, machines, infrastructure, and factories are property of the state. Therefore, there are no entrepreneurs that buy and sell intermediate products, that trade commodities, that employ workers, acquire machines, or hold factories in the expectation of earning a profit. Property, they are not traded, and consequently there are no prices, no market prices for them. And obviously, without price, you cannot compare the income and the expenditures. It follows that socialist planners cannot choose the most efficient method of production. As Mises puts it, quote, in the socialist commonwealths, every economic change becomes an undertaking whose success can be neither appraised in advance nor later retrospectively determined. There's only groping in the dark. Socialism is the abolition. Well, let me illustrate it with a simple example. Let's imagine that there are well-intentioned, of course, socialist planners that want to make sure that their subjects do not suffer cold in the winter. They can dispose of all resources, all workers, all resources, and they evaluate three options. I think they could build a wood stove in every house and then command in the winter 25% of workers to cut wood in the forests. Will command 75% of workers on bicycles, producing the electricity necessary to heating the house. And third, the planners, who are very politically correct, consider installing solar panels on the roofs of any house. Which option is the best? Well, each option entails costs. Some options use more silicon and time. Take the bicycle option. No? 75% of workers bicycling here to produce the heat. These 70% and services while they are bicycling. The stove option, for example, employs only 25%. But then the wood that is burned cannot be used at the same time to produce furniture. And the forests cannot be used. And other costs come, of course, with this. So the socialist planners, they are free to choose the option because they control all resources. But out of the very same reason, there are no prices for labor services, for wood, for silicon, etc. So it's impossible for socialist planners to compare the costs of the options monetarily. The final decision is completely up. If the planners, for example, choose the stove option, the planners cannot know if the produced heat is worth more to the people. It could have been produced with these that have been used. So is the heat in the winter more important to people than the goods and services that cannot come into existence in the winter? Would people not prefer to enjoy or wooden furniture? In other words, without market prices, there are no monetary profits and losses. There's no evidence if factors of production have been combined in a wealth-creating manner or if wealth has been squandered. In a market economy, the entrepreneur would suffer losses if the costs of cutting of firewood. But the socialist planners are necessarily blind. Socialism is planned chaos, as Mises says. Chaos, but the central planners have to brush over the pressure of individuals and impose their plan. Therefore, Mises totally correct states every socialist is a disguised dictator. And here in Brussels, I may add, there's a bunch of them. So Mises already in 1920 showed that socialism leads to chaos because rational economics. 20 more years, communists clung to power, accepting an immense capital consumption and empowerment of their people until finally they had to let loose. So it's for Mises' internal fame to have been the first to show that the whole project of socialism, the idea of central planning, that is to improve, is based on a fallacy. As Professor Jesus Huerta de Soto puts it, socialism is an intellectual, theoretically impossible for the agency in charge of implying institutions access to enough information to allow it to issue commands capable of coordinating society. Today, economic calculation in monetary terms is not impossible. Yet, economic calculation is hampered by government interventions that distort prices, likewise leading to chaos today. Regulation calculation not impossible, but they severely distort it, impoverishing society. Recall our example of providing heat in the winter. But the government introduces subsidies for producing energy by bicycling, or regulates the production. And economic calculation obviously will distort it, and again, with these subsidies and regulation, suddenly an option may become optimal because it's simply a waste of resources. So today the threat is not communism anymore. Today the threat is interventionism or statism, a new gentle form of socialism. It is this soft socialism of the paternalistic state that is not only a threat to individual liberties, but by distorting economic calculation leads to a new, more subtle prices are intervened by governments. Minimum wages, maximum rents, distorting tax schedules and government expenditure subsidies, regulations. For instance, this paternalistic state with his always benignant face prohibits us to use certain types of vacuum, certain types of light bulbs. He tells us what we cannot eat, what we cannot drink, what we cannot smoke, which medicine we which methods of production we may not employ, which types of investment we are not allowed to make, and which types of labor contracts or rental agreements we are not allowed to voluntarily agree upon. And if the ever stricter regulations on the national level would not be enough, there has been added another layer of regulations on the European level, which emanates from here, from all the politicians desperately trying to impose a centralized superstate, a new empire on the people of Europe, a Soviet 2.0. Besides this threat, the socialism never vanished and is as strong as ever. There, we suffer from massive price distortions, public management of expectations, the central planning of the interest rate and the money supply combined with a nationalist currency. Fiat money and central banking are socialism in money. This system, this monetary system, does not only just redistribution, interventionist spirals, cultural degeneration, and economic crises, but it also finances government expenditures directly and indirectly. Central banking and fiat money have enabled an enormous expansion of the state. The paternalistic state is sponsored by fiat money. And now we got trapped in an interventionist spiral of monetary policy. The ECB has promised to buy as many government bonds as necessary to save the euro. Interest rates are discussed, but the use of cash rates, these mental experiments of central bankers. Consequently, we see already attempts to eliminate cash. Once cash has been abolished, all transactions can be supervised by the state. There will be total control, just in order to satisfy the needs of monetary planners that feel that their are limited by the zero lower bound of interest rates. The total control of transactions would be a new form of totalitarianism, monetary totalitarianism. The Berlin Wall and communism have fallen 25 years ago, but it is not over. We have to be on before. We live in a world of chaos, with immense welfare losses. For civilization to thrive, we have to bring down the new soft type of socialism in these walls, right here. And we must also bring down the main sponsor of socialism, itself a center of central planning and managed chaos, central banking and fiat money. Let us hope that we can soon celebrate the complete fall of socialism. Thank you very much.
The message that I shall take home from that is that regulation distorts markets and makes them less efficient, and that freedom is good economics. And I think that is a message we are frequently. We have an opportunity now for a Q&A session. It's very rare that you get and the rest of our distinguished panel, so
but I'm a member of the ECR group, the European Conservative and Reform Party. I'd like to build a bridge between old style and European Parliament socialism. President Klaus, you talked about currency socialism, and in the European Union, that's really what we have, currency socialism. We've got an article in the Lisbon Treaty, 125, which says there shall be no bailout and every country is responsible for its own. But there was a night when Europe changed, from the 7th to the 8th of May 2010, when the no bailout clause was mechanism. And that is exactly the difference between socialism and the market economy. In the market economy, every country and entrepreneur is responsible for themselves. If you can't get by with your costs, you have to cut the costs or go bust. The bailout package, you're not responsible for yourself, but the community is responsible. That means you no longer have a market economy structure, but a socialist structure where individual countries or people aren't responsible for themselves, but society or the community as a whole. Precisely the difference between the market economy and socialism. But we hear time and again, especially in the plenary sessions, when there are cries from the south of Europe that the straitjacket of the euro is causing them to sacrifice their people to Europe. That is because they've given up their self-responsibility and independence and can't run their own policies. Yes.
Then they see
we are responsible for the Troika, and member states are obliged to help others. That means no more democracy. The community, rather than individual socialisms, politicians are responsible. How long will this community socialism system last, Mr. Klaus?
Ja, kann einfache Frage.
An easy question.
Ja.
I'll speak English.
Ist wahrscheinlich besser für diese
I'm sure German's the best language for these topics, but I'll speak English.
English, I guess. So, how long will could it hypothetically be prolonged? In this respect, I'm pessimistic. I'll tell you why. I spent still most of my life in communism, in the communist era, and there was a permanent issue, every day's question. How could it last longer? There will be end tomorrow, next month, next year. So we permanently, people permanently, that the system is so irrational that it can't last a longer time. And it lasted a longer time. So I'm afraid that Europe is still rich enough to pay the crazy fiscal transfers going from one country to another. So I'm afraid there will be no visit. Nevertheless, I consider it a total mistake, fundamental mistake. I agree with the title, The Tragedy of the Euro. It was a fundamental conceptual mistake to be done in Europe. It was partly a socialist idea, definitely. It was a political project, not an economic one, and so on. It killed you started talking about Verantwortung, about responsibility, so it killed the responsibility of individual and so on and so on. It socialized and so on. So I agree with you, but I'm not so optimistic about its end.
Could I?
Kurze Antwort.
Well, I'll attempt it. Shortly after the Second World War, when the communists seized power in the Czechoslovakia, clever minds and the economists said that the factors would become directors and so on, and it wouldn't take long at all to get this fixed. It took about 40 years. The second example, when on the 17th of November 89 revolution, well, a couple of years ago we had as a guest an actor with us and another gentleman, key figures, and I said, look, there was this revolution on the 17th of November. When did it become clear to you that it actually was a revolution, that the revolution had arrived? And he told me 2 days later, on the 19th, the first gentleman. But it completes the process and comes to an end. And that's the answer to your question. And when the end does come, it will be...
Right, could I have Stephen Wolfe, please? Okay.
Mr. Klaus, it's right to once again meet you. I met you a couple of years ago in the House. You presented a book to me, in which you kindly signed. You have been one of my political inspirations for somebody who not only lived through the period of the communist period, but fought them and challenged the ogre of the... There are many people in this chamber, including myself as the member of UKIP, that has entered this parliament for the first time. Time that we are actually also battling against the ogre of our time, that of the European Union. And Mr. Sulik, I'm also honoured to actually see someone else who's had to fight this battle. But despite the difficulties that we have, and the lessons that you've learned, are the lessons that you can give us as young pups, the Junkers and the Broses and the Schultz of this world, that you can give us advice of how we can bring down their walls and ensure that freedom once more comes across Europe?
To give advice, and it's cheap to give advice. No, but it's rather difficult. I don't want to give advice. For me, is very clear. We, in the communist era, in the late communism, we were permanently under some changes, some reforms. We consider them cosmetic changes, and we were repeatedly tried to tell the bosses of the country, the system is wrong. Basically, it can't be changed by partial reforms, by cosmetic. What we have to do is to change the system, to change the paradigm, the way of looking at things, the paradigm of thinking and behaving. I am afraid now, 25 years after the fall of communism, I have the same advice to everyone. Cosmetic changes, changing one bill or another. will not. We have to make Europe something similar to our systemic transformation, which we did 25 years ago, and the small changes are impossible. So when I'm asked what concrete measures you recommend, I say there are no, this is a wrong question, there are no concrete measures which could be introduced tomorrow or day after tomorrow. We have to accept that the system is fundamentally wrong, that the system must be changed. That's my understanding, and to achieve that understanding among Europeans.
Thank you. We'll tell the Conservative Party partial failure, and we will win when we get out completely.
I always use is the European reform, and I think that's essentially what President Klaus is saying. Sorry, we have a question.
May I say, we started to do the changes. Yep. The term in 1989, 1990, we immediately understood that we have to differentiate what we are doing with what had been done before. Term reform. The system is unreformable, this is basically the same. But you are saying, you know, we have systemic change because reforms are done inside a system. When you accept the system better, you can make reform. But when you are the system is basically rotten and basically wrong, then reforms are absolutely irrelevant and don't have any chance in any future.
I shall write it up. We have
you should.
Positive terms. We're here.
Really forgotten the words of Charles Marx. It is enough to install democracy, and stupid majority will build a socialism. During so-called communist times, there was a less and less socialism. In 1981, we had the most liberal economy in the Europe, and now every next government is more socialist. Stupid majority rules.
What country?
About Poland, Mr. Wilczek reform.
Well, I wouldn't say that the economic system in as far. I wouldn't say that the economic system in Poland in 1981 was a free market economy, you know. But I am afraid it was not. It was a very chaotic.
You could do abroad.
But you should differentiate total chaos from freedom in a positive sense. So Poland at the beginning of the 1980s was an absolutely lost system. But if your point says that the more democracy you have, the less chances for free markets you have, that's a quite rational idea. Yeah, we see it. But we have in Europe these days more democracy. I'm afraid we entered post-democracy, we entered the post-democratic world, and democracy in Europe is and to this building and to this parliament and to your legislative powers. So I'm afraid there is no freedom, no.
Question in the front row.
MP, a member of the French Parliament. Thank you for inviting me. I lead a political movement which is called Debout la France. But I'll just wait for Mr.
You want Polish?
English.
So, sorry, you want Czech? English?
English.
English. I think that's...
C'est bon, donc je me présente.
I'm Nicolas Dupont. Can you hear me now? Okay. I'm a member of the French National Assembly. I'm a leader of the Debout la France movement, which was with Philippe Séguin fighting the euro in 1992. In the referendum, we almost won the referendum. We only lost by a few votes in France. In 2005, there was another referendum. The French people voted no massively, 55%. And as you know, the same adopted through a parliamentary procedure, ignoring the French people. Since I've European institutions illegitimate for the French people. I have a question. I was very pleased you said that there is no democracy without substituting it with a European democracy. My real question is about the euro. You said it might take a long time to get rid of it, but how long can we observe the destruction of our economies? Europe in particular, how long can we watch this mutualization, which only exists on paper now? It's a commitment to share, but it's not a payment, because we know that payment is impossible. Financial transfers are impossible. So it's a world of illusion, of false commitments. We are distancing the countries in the south from the north and from Germany in particular. So my question is, how long will this illusion of financial transfers which don't exist last? How long can it last? There are two ways of stopping it. Either the countries in the north stop paying, they don't want to pay, and there is the whole question of the Karlsruhe Court, or the people in the south revolt, and the French are not far off that. There's going to be a social and political explosion in France. So do you think that it'll be years or decades?
Very good. Thank you very much for not being prepared to follow the French presentation. I almost didn't expect that anyone in France has such views as you. Very, very positive to hear it. There is someone here, French speaking. Thank you very much. Thank you very much for the outcomes of the French referendum years ago. We were really fascinated, and I must say that I was, as president of the country, I had some problems during the night after your referendum with Czech police, because we were celebrating it so loudly that the neighbor police came and then discovered that I was among the celebrating people. So we did it in our tennis club in Prague, down prison because of the results of your referendum. Isn't it nice, more or less? And you ask how long? Again, I am afraid. So the first question, perception of the people. And I am afraid that the person has not yet come to Europe. The people still believe that the system somehow functions. Those people still have a chance to go to spend their summer holidays on Mallorca or south of France or I don't know where, Turkey, Greece. So trouble yet. I am not sure it will disappear tomorrow. Not the Czech Republic of France, but as in macro, I say that when I see that the economic growth in Italy in the last 10 years is minus. That in a decade there is a GDP decline in the European countries by 10%, and nothing happens. I still think that the people are rich enough not to feel the problems. The same story is with the fiscal transfers. For is the numbers of the loans given to Greece, the first loan 100, if you remember, 3 years ago, 100. And I met Angela Merkel the next morning, and she said, terrible. It was, I said, why are you so, why do you see it as such a big problem? This amount, 110 billion euros, given to Greece, night from the 8th to 9th May 2010, I told to Angela Merkel, is exactly the amount of money you pay in Germany annually for 20 years as fiscal transfers from West to East Germany, to the former GDR. So Germany has been able to pay a reunification of Germany. The amount of money Greece got once, not just from Germany, but from the whole European Union. So when Germany was able to finance 20 years, I'm not sure that the fiscal transfer will disappear tomorrow or day after tomorrow. Europe is still, and I'm afraid the perception of a total crisis is not yet there, to my great regret.
You have time for a question. Do you have a last question from anyone? Young lady over here.
May I ask, you are now criticizing formable and fundamentally wrong, but at the same time you signed the accession treaty of the Czech Republic to the European Union. So what made you do this change of opinion? You had the same opinions as you have now, so why did you sign it then?
Well, I haven't changed my opinion. I immediately after the fall of communism, I understood of the European integration process, and I was critical about it since the very beginning. But as I said, all the people in my country of the Velvet Revolution were marching on the streets in Prague with the banner "Back to Europe." We wanted, really, they wanted to be again a normal European country, whatever the term normal means, after half a century of communism. They wanted to get rid of the past. They wanted to get rid of something east of Czechoslovakia or Czech Republic at that time. So I think we had no chance. It's like Switzerland, Liechtenstein, Norway, to say that we could continue. So we had no other chance, and an ex-communist or post-communist country had a chance. European integration process, or as Mr. Lukashenko in Belarusia, or as Mr. Milan in Serbia, Milosevic in Serbia. So we had either a Lukashenko-Milosevic style of governments or participation in the European integration. So we were country which killed us the free to choose in the year 2004 by joining 40 years ago, by joining the European Union, instead of staying in EFTA, in the European Free Trade Area, in EFTA, and not to enter the European Union. So the British for joining the at that time EC, and they simply eliminated us any chance to be free to choose. So we were not free to choose. It was a forced move in the terminology of chess playing for us to enter the European Union.
Yes, I can only agree with Mr. Klaus. Really a chance to do something else. Several years later, after joining Slovakia to European Union, I tried to stop the European. It was not possible. It was possible only in theoretical way, but really it was not signed. I will not vote for ASM. Government fall down. It's a result. So the power was so huge, so strong, coming from Brussels. It was not possible. He wanted to make a referendum in Greece. No more Prime Minister of Greece. It's reality.
Good. Can I comment?
President Václav pessimistic or this system of the European socialism can last for maybe decades, which sounds very pessimistic to me. So a little bit more optimistic words. I really believe that the and that it can be soon, that the European Union one day, and I hope that I will be able to congratulate the United Kingdom as a first country who will leave the EU one day, maybe in a few years.
Yeah,
thank you.
Thank you very much. Yes. Just thank our distinguished panel for being here. Can I thank our audience for being here? And most of all, can I thank President Václav Klaus for coming here to Brussels against his better judgment, just the benefit of his advice.